Thomas Brennan stood at the fence line watching the sun climb over the mountain peaks just like he had done every morning for the past 15 years since Martha passed. His hands rested on the weathered wood and he could feel the grain beneath his palms worn smooth by time and weather. The ranch stretched out before him with its golden fields and distant cattle, and he knew every inch of it like he knew the lines on his own face. He was 53 years old now, and sometimes he caught himself talking to the horses more than he should. They were good listeners though, and they never asked questions he couldn't answer. The loneliness had become like an old coat he wore without thinking about it anymore. It kept him warm in its own strange way, even if it wasn't the kind of warmth he remembered from before. His brother James had been pestering him for months about getting some help around the place. James lived in town with his wife Carol, and they worried about Thomas out here by himself. He'd finally agreed just to stop the nagging, and James had said he knew someone who could arrange for a housekeeper. Thomas didn't ask too many questions because he figured it didn't matter much who showed up as long as they could cook and didn't talk his ear off. That morning started like any other. He fed the horses and checked on the cattle and came back to the house for coffee that he'd make himself like always. He was standing at the kitchen sink looking out the window when he saw the dust trail on the road. Vehicles didn't come out this way often, and for a moment his heart did a little jump, thinking something might be wrong. The car pulled up in front of the house and sat there for a minute before the door opened. Thomas wiped his hands on his jeans and walked to the front porch, expecting maybe it was James or the feed supplier. What he saw instead made him stop right there on the top step. A woman got out of the car. She was wearing a cream-colored dress that seemed too fancy for ranch country, and she had dark hair that fell past her shoulders. She reached into the back seat and pulled out a suitcase that looked like it had traveled 1,000 miles. When she turned around and saw him standing there, she went very still. "Mr. Brennan," she called out, and her voice carried across the yard with a slight tremor in it. "That's me," he said, and walked down the steps slowly because something about this didn't seem right. She came forward and he could see now that she was younger than him by maybe 10 years or so, and she had kind eyes that were trying to hide worry. "I'm Eleanor Hayes," she said, and set down her suitcase. "I was told you were expecting me." Thomas scratched the back of his neck and looked at her suitcase and then back at her face. "Ma'am, I was expecting a housekeeper, but I think there's been some kind of mistake." The color drained from Eleanor's face and she put one hand to her throat. "A housekeeper," she repeated. "Mr. Brennan, I was told. The agency said you were looking for." She stopped and took a breath. "I'm a mail-order bride." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, and Thomas felt his stomach drop. He thought about James and the phone calls and the way his brother had been so eager to help, and suddenly it all made a terrible kind of sense. "Oh Lord," Thomas said, and took off his hat to run his hand through his hair. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. I think my brother. He must have. I didn't know anything about this." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back fast. "I sold everything I had," she said quietly. "My apartment in Chicago. My mother's furniture. I used the last of my savings to get here." She looked around at the ranch and the mountains, and her shoulders started to shake. "I have nowhere else to go." Thomas had never felt so low in his entire life. This woman had come all this way thinking she was starting a new life, and instead she'd found a confused old rancher who didn't know up from down. He stood there looking at her, and something in his chest that had been closed up tight for 15 years started to crack open just a little. "Now hold on," he said, and his voice came out gentler than he expected. "Let's just take a breath here. You came all this way and that wasn't your fault. Come inside and we'll figure something out. I'm not going to leave you stranded." Eleanor looked at him with those eyes that were trying so hard to be brave, and she nodded. Thomas picked up her suitcase, and it was heavier than he expected, and he wondered what pieces of her life she'd packed inside it. He led her into the house, and it occurred to him that no woman had walked through that door since Martha died. The kitchen was clean enough because he kept things tidy, but it was plain and worn, and he saw it now through her eyes. She sat down at the table and folded her hands in front of her, and he put on a pot of coffee because it was the only thing he could think to do. "I'll call my brother," Thomas said. "We'll sort this out. Maybe there's a hotel in town or something until we figure out what to do." "The nearest town is 40 miles away," Eleanor said softly. "I saw the signs." Thomas poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her. Up close he could see the tiredness in her face and the way her hands trembled just slightly. "Tell me what happened," he said. How did you end up here? So she told him. Her voice was quiet but steady as she explained that she'd been a schoolteacher in Chicago for 20 years. She'd been married once a long time ago but he died young and she never found anyone else. Her friends had all moved away or gotten busy with their own families and she'd found herself alone in a city that felt colder every year. She'd seen an advertisement for a matchmaking service that connected people looking for fresh starts and she'd thought maybe it was time to be brave. They showed me your picture, she said and looked down at her coffee. They told me you were a widower who ran a ranch and needed a partner. Someone who understood hard work and quiet living. It sounded like maybe we'd both been lonely long enough. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. He thought about James and how his brother had probably thought he was doing something good. James had always been the fixer in the family and he'd never understood that some things couldn't be fixed with a phone call and good intentions. I'm sorry, Thomas said, and he meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. This isn't right what happened to you. But you're here now and you're tired and I'm not going to send you away tonight. The spare room is clean and you can stay as long as you need to figure things out. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears again and this time she let one fall. That's very kind, she said. But I can't impose on you like that. This is your home and I'm a stranger. You're not a stranger, Thomas said. You're someone who got dealt a bad hand and that's not your fault. Besides, and here he managed a small smile, I could actually use some help around here and if you're willing to stay for a bit maybe we can work something out. I'll pay you fair wages and give you room and board and you can take your time deciding what comes next. They sat there in the kitchen while the sun moved across the floor and somewhere outside a meadowlark was singing. Finally Eleanor nodded and said, all right, in a voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. The days that followed were strange for both of them. Thomas showed Eleanor around the ranch and explained how things worked and she listened carefully and asked good questions. She took over the cooking and the first night she made pot roast that melted in his mouth and he realized he'd been living on beans and toast for longer than he wanted to admit. They worked out a rhythm without talking about it much. He'd get up early and do the outside work while she'd handle the house and the garden she started in the side yard. They'd have breakfast together and dinner and sometimes they'd sit on the porch in the evening and watch the stars come out. They didn't talk a lot at first but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes when two people are both thinking their own thoughts but don't mind sharing the space. Eleanor had a way about her that reminded Thomas of steady rain. Not the dramatic storms that blow through and knock everything down but the gentle kind that soaks in deep and makes things grow. She never rushed him or pushed him to talk but when he did say something she listened like it mattered. She'd hum while she worked in the kitchen and sometimes he'd catch himself stopping just to hear it. One evening about 3 weeks after she'd arrived Thomas found her sitting on the porch steps looking out at the mountains. The sun was setting and everything was painted gold and pink and she had tears running down her face. He almost turned around to give her privacy but something made him walk over instead. You all right? He asked and sat down beside her leaving a respectful distance between them. I was just thinking, Eleanor said and wiped her eyes. When I left Chicago I thought I was running away from loneliness. But maybe I was running towards something instead. I just didn't know what it was yet. Thomas looked at the mountains and thought about all the years he'd spent here alone. I know what you mean, he said. After Martha died I thought the loneliness would kill me. But then it didn't and I got used to it. Started thinking maybe that was just how life was going to be from here on out. Do you miss her? Eleanor asked and there was no jealousy in the question, just honest curiosity. Every day, Thomas said. But not the way I used to. Now it's more like she's part of the landscape. She's in the house and the land and the way the light falls in the morning. I don't talk to her anymore but I feel like she's still here somehow. Eleanor nodded and they sat there while the stars started to appear. I think she'd be glad you're not alone anymore, she said finally. Something shifted in Thomas then. He'd been carrying guilt around like a stone in his pocket for even considering that maybe having Eleanor here was nice. It felt like a betrayal somehow, like he was forgetting Martha. But hearing Eleanor say that made him realize that Martha would have wanted him to keep living. She'd always said life was for the living and sitting around waiting to die wasn't any kind of tribute to love. The seasons changed and Eleanor stayed. They never talked about whether it was permanent or temporary because neither of them wanted to break whatever spell they were under. She planted flowers around the porch and fixed the curtains in the living room, and slowly the house started to feel like a home again instead of just a place where Thomas ate and slept. He found himself noticing little things about her. The way she'd stand at the kitchen window in the morning with her coffee and watch the sun come up. How she'd always leave him the last piece of pie without mentioning it. The careful way she'd fold his shirts when she did the laundry, making sure the collars laid flat. These small acts of care undid him in ways he couldn't explain. One afternoon in late summer, Thomas was mending a fence when his hand slipped and he gashed his palm on a piece of wire. It wasn't deep, but it bled like crazy, and he walked back to the house holding a rag around it. Eleanor took one look and sat him down at the kitchen table and cleaned it up with gentle hands. "You need to be more careful," she said, and her voice had a scolding tone that made him smile. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and watched her wrap his hand in clean gauze. When she was done, she didn't let go right away. She held his hand in both of hers and looked at the bandage and then up at his face. "Thomas," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his first name. "I need to tell you something." His heart started beating faster and he nodded. "I came here thinking I knew what I wanted," she said. "A fresh start. A practical arrangement. Someone to share the work and the days with. But somewhere along the way this became more than that. At least for me it did." She took a breath. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, and if you want me to go I will. But I needed you to know that I'm happy here. Happier than I've been in 20 years. And it's not just the ranch or the mountains. It's you." Thomas looked at their hands and thought about all the years of loneliness and all the nights he'd lain awake wondering if he'd ever feel alive again. He thought about Martha and the life they'd had and how she'd made him promise not to waste the years he had left. He thought about Eleanor and her gentle ways and how she'd somehow slipped past all his defenses without him even noticing. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was rough. "I haven't touched a woman in 15 years. Haven't even thought about it because I figured that part of my life was over. But then you showed up by mistake and turned everything sideways." He lifted his good hand and touched her cheek, and she leaned into it. "I'm happy too. Didn't think I had any right to be, but here we are." She smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "So what do we do now?" she asked. "I guess we just keep going," he said. "One day at a time. If that's all right with you." "That's more than all right," she said. They sat there in the kitchen with the afternoon light streaming through the windows, and somewhere in the distance a horse whinnied. Thomas thought about calling James to tell him he'd been right after all, even if he'd gone about it all wrong. But that could wait. Right now he just wanted to sit here with Eleanor's hand in his and feel the way his heart had started beating again after so many years of just going through the motions. That evening they sat on the porch like they always did, but this time Thomas reached over and took her hand. It felt natural, like something they should have been doing all along. They didn't need to talk about what came next or put labels on what they were becoming. They were just two people who'd been lonely too long and had found each other by accident, or maybe by something that looked like fate if you believed in that sort of thing. The mountains turned purple in the fading light and the first stars appeared, and Thomas realized that the loneliness he'd worn for so long had finally slipped away. In its place was something warmer and stronger and more real than he dared to hope for. Eleanor squeezed his hand and he squeezed back, and they sat there together while the night came on, gentle and full of promise. Sometimes the best things in life come to us sideways when we're not looking for them. Sometimes kindness shows up in unexpected forms and second chances arrive by mistake. And sometimes two hearts that have been quiet for too long find a way to start beating in rhythm again, proving that it's never too late to come home to yourself and to love and to the simple grace of human connection. The ranch went on like ranches do, with its endless work and changing seasons. But now there were two people sharing the load and the days and the quiet evenings. Thomas taught Eleanor to ride and she taught him to laugh again. They built a life together that was rooted in respect and kindness and the understanding that both of them had lived long enough to know what mattered and what didn't. And if sometimes Thomas thought about the strange chain of events that had brought Eleanor to his door, he just shook his head and smiled. His brother James had meant well, and sometimes meaning well was enough. The rest was just life doing what it does best, bringing people together when they need each other most and reminding them that the human heart is far more resilient than we give it credit for.